Imagine waking up tomorrow and your gas station has no fuel. Not because of a storm, not because of a trucking strike, because somewhere on the other side of the world, the single largest natural gas field on planet Earth just got bombed. And the fires are still burning. That is not a hypothetical. That happened yesterday. On March 18, 2026, Israeli aircraft struck the South Pars gas field in southern Iran, the largest natural gas reservoir on Earth, holding roughly 1,800 trillion cubic feet of gas. And within hours of that strike, Iran hit back. Not at Israel, not at U.S. military bases. Iran hit Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE. It struck the world's biggest LNG export facility at Laffan in Qatar and set it ablaze. And right now, as you are watching this, Brent crude is trading above $107 a barrel. Gas prices in California have crossed $6.50 per gallon. And the global energy system, the one that heats your home, powers your city, and keeps the food on grocery store shelves, is operating under a level of stress it has never experienced before in recorded history. This is not background news. This is not a story happening far away, with no effect on your life. This is the moment that changes everything. And here on Unlocked History Hub, we are going to walk through exactly what happened, why it happened, what a nuclear plant being hit in a live war zone means for the entire world, and most importantly, what all of this is going to cost you and every American family whether or not you ever think about the Middle East. Stay right here, because the second half of this breakdown is where the picture gets truly alarming. Let us start at the beginning of what just happened, because the speed of this escalation has been staggering even by the standards of a war that has already been running for 20 days. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a joint military operation against Iran called Operation Epic Fury. The opening strikes killed Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and several of the country's top military commanders. Since that day, Iran has been firing back relentlessly, over 300 ballistic missiles aimed at Israel alone, plus thousands of drones and cruise missiles targeting U.S. military bases spread across Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the UAE. The war has been brutal from day one, but until this week there had been an unspoken boundary that neither side had crossed: energy infrastructure. That boundary no longer exists. On March 18th, Israeli aircraft struck the processing facilities at Asaluya, the onshore hub that manages all output from South Pars. According to the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, those strikes took offline roughly 100 million cubic meters of gas per day, about 14% of South Pars' total daily output. That single strike alone is enough to disrupt heating systems, power plants, and the petrochemical industry across Iran. But the consequences do not stop at Iran's border. South Pars is geologically continuous with Qatar's North Field, the same reservoir, just divided by an international boundary in the Persian Gulf. Qatar's side of that field produces approximately 77 million tons of liquefied natural gas every year. That is 1/5 of the entire global LNG supply. Europe uses it to heat homes. Asian countries use it to generate electricity. American companies buy it on international markets. When Israel struck South Pars, it did not just hit Iran. It sent a tremor through the entire global energy architecture. Iran's response came within hours. Ballistic missiles and drones struck Qatar's Ras Laffan industrial city, the largest LNG production facility on Earth. Qatar Energy confirmed the attack caused extensive damage. Emergency teams were deployed to contain fires at the site. Multiple LNG facilities were struck again in the early hours of Thursday, causing additional significant fires. As a result, Qatar has now had to halt all gas production. Let that sink in. 1/5 of the world's LNG supply has stopped moving, and Iran did not stop at Qatar. Iranian forces also hit Saudi Arabia's Samref refinery and the Jubail petrochemical complex. They struck the UAE's Al Hassan gas field. They hit the Mesaieed complex in Qatar a second time. Saudi Arabia's defense ministry said it intercepted an Iranian missile targeting the port of Yanbu, the backup route for Saudi oil exports since the Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed at the start of this war. And an Iranian missile struck an Israeli oil refinery complex in Haifa on Thursday. This is no longer a war with a front line. The front line is now the entire energy map of the Middle East. Before we go any further, if you are finding this analysis valuable, I want to ask you right now to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Here at Unlocked History Hub, We track the stories that are actually reshaping your world, and we explain them in a way that gives you real context, not just headlines. Hit the like button too. It helps more people find this breakdown who need to see it. Now let's keep going, because there is a layer to this story that almost nobody is covering clearly enough. The nuclear dimension of this war is something I think deserves very direct and honest discussion. When this conflict began on February 28th, one of the stated U.S. goals was to permanently prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. The Natanz nuclear facility and the Fordo enrichment complex were struck in the opening days of the war. The U.S. and Israel struck the Bushehr nuclear power plant, and a drone hit a building on the premises of that facility during the conflict. The UN's nuclear watchdog chief, IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi, confirmed that the Bushehr reactor itself was not affected, and there were no casualties from that particular strike. But he said something that I think every person watching this needs to hear clearly. He said, and I am paraphrasing his words closely, that even with enormous damage to Iran's physical nuclear infrastructure, at the end of this conflict, the enriched nuclear material will still be there, and the enrichment knowledge will still be there. Iran entered 2026 with approximately 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity. Experts at the Arms Control Association have noted that this is enough material, if further enriched to weapons grade, for roughly 10 nuclear weapons. The location of all of that material is not fully confirmed. Some of it was at Fordo, some at Natanz, and some may have been moved before the strikes began. The IAEA currently cannot verify the full status of that stockpile because its inspectors were evacuated when the strikes began. In my view, this is the most consequential unresolved question of this entire war. Destroying the buildings does not eliminate the knowledge or the material, and a successor Iranian government of any political character will inherit a strategic environment where the argument for nuclear deterrence has been strengthened, not weakened, by everything that has happened in the last 20 days. Now let us talk about the global damage that this war has already caused, because I want to give you the full picture of what has happened to the world economy in just 20 days, starting from the moment the first bombs fell on February 28th. Brent crude oil prices were at $72 per barrel the day before the war began. As of this week, Brent is trading above $107. That is a 40+% increase in 20 days. West Texas Intermediate is approaching $99. The International Energy Agency has described this as the most severe oil supply disruption in the history of global energy markets. Not the worst since 2022, not the worst since the Gulf War, the worst ever recorded. The reason is the Strait of Hormuz. 20% of all global oil supply, roughly 21 million barrels per day, passes through that narrow waterway. Iran closed it effectively at the start of the war, and it has remained disrupted ever since. Commercial shipping companies have been rerouting vessels around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, adding weeks to delivery times and enormous cost to every cargo that used to move through the Gulf. The Suez Canal route is also being avoided because of Houthi threats in the Red Sea. The world's shipping lanes have been rerouted around the entire bottom of Africa, and that cost is being passed directly to consumers. For American families, this is already visible in ways that go far beyond the gas pump. Fertilizer prices are surging because nearly 50% of global urea and sulfur exports move through the Strait of Hormuz, and liquefied natural gas is a key feedstock for nitrogen fertilizers. When fertilizer gets expensive, food production gets expensive. When food production gets expensive, grocery prices rise, and they are rising right now. Analysts at the Pacific Research Institute confirmed the war is putting upward pressure on electricity bills, grocery costs, and transportation prices across the United States. Airlines including Qantas, SAS, Air New Zealand, Indigo, and Air India have all announced fare hikes because jet fuel costs have spiked. Dubai International Airport was struck during this conflict. Abu Dhabi sustained damage. Thousands of flights have been grounded or rerouted across the Gulf region. Stock markets fell sharply at the start of this conflict, with the Dow Jones dropping over 400 points on March 2nd alone. Economic forecasters at Chatham House have projected that if this conflict continues for several months, oil prices could reach $130 per barrel, a level at which recession stops being a projection and becomes a description. Outside the United States, the damage is hitting differently but just as hard. Europe was already vulnerable because of the loss of Russian gas supplies following the Ukraine war. Energy costs across European industry were elevated before a single bomb fell on Iran. Now, with Qatar's LNG halted and South Par's processing damaged, European gas benchmark prices jumped 6% in a single day this week. The Eurozone is projected to contract in the second quarter of 2026. In Asia, the situation is even more acute. Approximately 80% of Asia's oil imports pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Vietnam has oil reserves covering fewer than 20 days of normal consumption. Pakistan, Indonesia, and several other Asian economies are in a similar position. Japan, South Korea, and China together account for nearly 70% of all oil moving through the strait. Iraq's electricity ministry confirmed this week that Iranian gas supplies to the country had been halted due to the conflict, sharply cutting power production. Turkey is facing energy price pressure that threatens to destabilize a fragile economic policy already under stress. The UN World Food Programme has warned that this military escalation is driving significant long-term increases in global food prices, echoing the food crisis of 2022 when the Ukraine war disrupted grain supplies. The humanitarian footprint of this war is not limited to the battlefield. It is landing on kitchen tables across 4 continents. I want to share my honest perspective on one aspect of this war that I believe has been significantly underreported. On February 27, 2026, one day before the bombs fell, Oman's Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi said publicly that a breakthrough had been reached in the nuclear negotiations between Iran and the United States. He said Iran had agreed to never stockpile enriched uranium and to full verification by the IAEA. He said peace was within reach and that talks were expected to resume on March 2nd. Then the strikes began. After the war started, al-Busaidi said he was dismayed and that active and serious negotiations had been undermined. British National Security Advisor Jonathan Powell, who was in the room for the Geneva sessions, described Iran's proposal as significant and said real momentum was building. In my assessment, the question of whether that diplomatic window could have prevented a war that has now killed thousands, displaced over 1 million people in Lebanon alone, triggered the worst energy shock in history, and set the entire Gulf region on fire, that question deserves to be asked seriously and answered honestly, not dismissed. Reasonable people can disagree about whether diplomacy would ultimately have worked, but the evidence that it was genuinely close is real and documented. And what that evidence tells us about the cost of the path that was chosen instead is something that will be debated for a generation. There is also the matter of what this war is costing American taxpayers specifically. The Pentagon is seeking an additional $200 billion to fund this conflict. Total military operation costs through the first 20 days have been estimated at over $11 billion, roughly $76 per American taxpayer. 13 U.S. service members have been confirmed dead. Around 200 have been injured, many seriously. The USS Gerald Ford aircraft carrier, which has now been deployed for 268 consecutive days, docked in Greece this week after a fire broke out on board. Sailors reported sleeping on floors with no change of clothes. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said the war funding number could move higher. He said it takes money to, in his words, kill bad guys. The American public, according to consistent polling, opposes this war at a rate of 90%. And yet, here we are on day 20, with the Pentagon asking for $200 billion more, gas above $4 per gallon nationally, and the world's largest gas field on fire. As I look at all of these threads together, the South Pars strike, the Qatar LNG shutdown, the Gulf-wide energy infrastructure now being actively targeted on both sides, the nuclear material with an uncertain location, the diplomatic track that was severed one day before an agreement appeared possible, the Russia factor with the Wall Street Journal confirming Moscow is providing drones and satellite intelligence to Iranian forces, what I see is a conflict that has moved well past any defined endpoint. The Brookings Institution assessed this week that for Iran's regime, imposing high costs on the global economy is their survival strategy. Iran cannot match American and Israeli air power in the sky, but it can make the price of this war high enough and wide enough and painful enough for enough countries simultaneously that the pressure for de-escalation builds faster than the political will to continue. That strategy is working economically. Brent above $107 is not just a number on a trading screen. It is the mathematical expression of how much pain has already been distributed across the global economy in 20 days. The question of where this goes next is genuinely open. The most dangerous scenario on the table right now involves Karg Island, Iran's oil export hub that handles 90% of the country's crude revenues. U.S. officials have said publicly this week that no options are off the table regarding Kharg Island. If that facility becomes a target, analysts project oil prices could reach $150 per barrel or higher. At that level, you are not looking at a slowdown. You are looking at a global recession that would dwarf anything since 2008. That is not a forecast being made by fringe observers. It is the assessment of serious economists at institutions that have been studying energy markets and geopolitical risk for decades. On the other side of the ledger, the path to de-escalation requires political will from parties who are currently in the middle of active combat operations, with significant domestic pressure on both sides to hold firm. The ceasefire calls from France, Germany, and the broader international community have produced statements but not yet a framework. The diplomatic off-ramp is there in theory. Getting there requires decisions that nobody has yet been willing to make. What I am confident about is this. The world that existed on February 27, 2026, the day before any of this began, is not the world we are living in now. The energy map has been redrawn. The LNG supply chain that kept European homes warm and Asian factories running has been fractured. The nuclear material sitting somewhere in Iran represents a proliferation risk that military action has made more complicated, not simpler, to resolve. And every American family filling a gas tank or buying groceries right now is paying a price for decisions that were made in rooms they were never invited into. That is the full picture. That is what this war actually looks like beyond the military headlines. And here on Unlocked History Hub, we are going to keep following every development as this story continues to unfold, because understanding the real scope of what is happening is the most important thing any of us can do right now. I want to hear your thoughts on this. Drop a comment below right now and tell me, do you think energy infrastructure should ever be a legitimate target in warfare? Do you think the diplomatic path that was apparently within reach on February 27th could have prevented all of this? And do you think the American public is getting an honest accounting of what this war is actually costing? Your perspective genuinely matters, and I read every comment. If this breakdown gave you context you could not get anywhere else, share this video with someone in your life who needs to understand what is happening right now. Share it with your family. Share it with your friends. Every share helps this analysis reach more people, and if you are not yet subscribed to Unlocked History Hub, this is the moment. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because the next video in this series goes even deeper into what comes next. We are not done covering this story, not even close.